But for that time, for that situation, Switzerland abandoned neutrality. And the Swiss ambassador to Ukraine, Claude Wild, used to be a friend of mine. And he was the Swiss ambassador up to early last year. And he said very officially that Switzerland was not neutral in this conflict. So it abandoned neutrality for this conflict, which is quite odd. And the problem here is that, and that shows also the lack of strategic vision, because the purpose or the utility of having a neutral country like Switzerland is that it provides an escape door in the conflict. Today, the West, and especially the European Union, is not prepared and not set to talk to Russia, and has no really the willingness to do it. The Americans have tried to do it, but they haven't found the right language with Russia. And therefore, the attempts of Steve Witkoff also that failed definitely with Kellogg. And Steve Witkoff tried also, but Steve Witkoff is not a politician. He didn't understand what is at stake. He's an intelligent person, he's a businessman, but not a politician. And therefore, all the talks he had with Putin didn't lead to anywhere. And that's the reason why we are in the situation we are today. But so the Americans tried, but they haven't found, they don't communicate really with the Russians. How come can they come to the position of being even a candidate for a position in the European Union and things like this? Is that those people should have disappeared from a public life since years, because they have demonstrated their incapacity, their inability of leading or managing situations. They are institutional stupid. This is amazing. And what will come next is apparently not better. As long as we can anticipate who will come next, maybe we can be surprised by some miracle. But as of today, what we can see shows that we are going from disaster to disaster. And we are getting in even more complicated situations, because beyond complex situation on the ground, and the conflict or the solution of the conflict in Ukraine is obviously complex, even if the solution would have been very simple 3 years ago. Today, it becomes more complex, although it was in a diplomatic mission, by the way. You had the downing of the KL 007 in the Sakhalin, over Sakhalin Peninsula in 1983, if I'm not wrong, which was a significant incident between the Soviet Union, Japan, and the West at large, because it was a civilian airliner that was downed by a Soviet fighter. So that was a significant incident. But although we had all these incidents, we always kept talking to each other. This never led to a break of the diplomatic relations. We always kept talking. There was condemnations, there were criticisms and all that. That was clear. But you still had a dialogue. You still had a negotiation. You had all these negotiations about the nuclear arsenal, the START negotiation, SALT negotiation, and all that. All these negotiations were, in fact, the expression of an existing dialogue, regardless of everything that could happen, and the antagonism and the support for terrorism that the Soviet Union did in many parts of the world, or the support to a guerrilla or revolutionary movement in some area. So we know that this happened, but it didn't prevent this dialogue. How come have we been led into a situation as of today where we don't even dare to talk to each other? There's something that beyond my understanding, because the situation was to some extent much worse 50 years ago than it is today. But But the Israelis are not, this is embedded into the culture, I would say, that you just kill people. And that makes the Israeli, on the one hand, extremely inefficient, effective, but inefficient. That means that they kill a lot of people, but they don't achieve the objective. But they're effective in killing people. And this is something that requires, in my view, much more thinking. And the problem with people like Lindsey Graham, by oversimplifying the problem, they tend to avoid any solution. And the problem with that is if we don't have any solution, that means that the situation will, in fact, degrade and worsen for both. But I think the determination of the Palestinians is stronger than the Israelis. And we have seen that, by the way, after those 12 days war, that the Israelis are much more vulnerable than the others. They don't have the determination. They are driven by hate, not by determination. Palestinians are driven not by hate, by determination. It's exactly the opposite. That's why the Palestinians are able to they manage to keep their resistance movement quite alive after 80 years, while the Israelis are not even able to sustain 12 days struggle. So that's what we see is a structural and intellectual weakness of the Israelis, which is, if we go deeper, which is based on a legitimacy weakness. Recently, you had in France, for instance, the head of the equivalent of the Joint Chief of Staff, or the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in France, which is the Chef d'État-Major des Armées, who explained that France is now the main target or a defined target of Russia. Where does he get that from? Nobody has ever said that. I've never heard that. Never. And why should France be the primary target of Russia? This doesn't make any sense. Meaning that those guys, and when I say those guys, military people, who are supposed to be those who make the decision based on what they see on the ground. Because at the end of the day, you fight the enemy you can identify. You don't fight if you have nothing in front of you. So you need to have a very good reconnaissance and knowledge of what is in front of you. This guy is just inventing out of the blue a threat, and is in fact planning the development of a French army based on an imaginary threat. And by not being directly involved in a conflict, you could adopt a posture of mediation and help to mediate in the conflict. Even if you have a preference, although a good mediator doesn't have any preference, he mediates, so he's in the middle. But even if you have a preference, then you try to accommodate the two and try to, ideally this would have been done before February 2022, but the European Union didn't. Therefore, we went into a conflict situation in which the Europe was not prepared for and has no strategy whatsoever to address the problem. And that applies, you mentioned Switzerland, that applies to Switzerland the same. Switzerland, also we have to acknowledge, because of the pressure made by the European Union and the US, by the way, on the government of Switzerland, in order to have, because the idea in February 2022 was to isolate Russia completely from the rest of the world, completely. The idea was to have no line of communication with Russia. And that's why, by the way, the European Union still struggles to have China condemning Russia and all that. As of today, it doesn't make any sense, but they continue to have that. Because the idea that the West had in February 2022 was this brutal and very stiff isolation of Russia would bring the collapse of the government in Russia, and therefore the collapse of Russia. That was the idea. Everybody knows that Iran is right as to the nuclear initiative. Everybody knows it. But nobody wants the risk to antagonize both Israel and the US. For Russia, it's a little bit different because here you have a lot of other aspects. And again, as I said before, we are more in the area of psychiatry than in the area of politics because, and that's interesting because that's something I mentioned in one of my books, but it's very a coincidence that all these people who are in charge today of those countries or the politics in Europe are the grandchildren of people who were Nazi or anti-Soviet during World War II. So to some extent, I said in one of my books, this is the war of the grandchildren, because somehow they make the war that their grandfather didn't manage to win. And today they try. So there is probably something. I'm not, again, we are in the area of psychiatry, which is definitely not my area. And there are probably things to dig into that, because that would explain how this inability to even think about opening a dialogue is. This is something we haven't seen during the Cold War. Even during the Cold War, even after the incident we had, you had one of the U.S. liaison officer killed in East Germany, for instance, in the early 80s. That was Ludwig Carlson, if I'm not wrong. He was killed by some East German soldier. And that's where the usefulness of a neutral country that would help to bypass these barriers you have between the big actors, and that could provide, as I said, an escape door to the crisis by providing a possibility of dialogue with both sides. That's why you had, for instance, Switzerland, as Switzerland still represents the US interest in Iran, and represent the Iranian interest in the US, for instance. It used to do so also for Cuba before Obama reestablished diplomatic relationship with Cuba. But so that's a purpose, not the purpose, but it's where a neutral country can be useful. The problem is that the current government in Switzerland didn't understand this opportunity. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Europe is fanatical against Russia, very similar to Ursula von der Leyen and all that. So that means there is no chance to have here a broader understanding or a kind of a geopolitical vision of the situation. And that's the reason why Switzerland, in fact, has lost all its credibility, because today the Russians consider that Switzerland has failed as a neutral state, belongs to the Western camp, and therefore we have no channel of communication anymore with the West. While during the Cold War, for instance, Switzerland was a privileged way of communication between the Russians, the Soviets at the time, and the US. And I have was born in Geneva, because it's nice to say Macron, we will recognize the state of Palestine and all that, even if this is the 10th time he says so. I don't expect much from him. But in any case, we see that beyond words, no Western country is ready to act. When it comes to Russia, not everybody, but some countries are ready to send troops in Ukraine and send troops to protect Ukrainians. And so when it comes to Palestinians, nobody mentions even that. Even they can even agree on using, for instance, peace enforcement for the Palestinians. This would be a possibility. You have peacekeeping, where once you have a peace agreement, then you maintain peace by having troops. That's what you have in Lebanon, for instance. And when you cannot reach an agreement, then you can have what the UN calls peace enforcement, mean that you you send troops in order to bring the parties to the negotiation table, meaning that you enforce a negotiation, a peace through negotiation. And that's something that would be legally feasible, but nobody wants to do it. And that shows how the Western politicians are cowards, because we have all the legal instruments to do that. One important one is the decision of the International Court of Justice, who confirmed the fact that any Israeli presence on the Palestinian territory is illegal. Any Israeli in the West Bank, in Gaza, wherever, these people are illegally there. And that should make, and when you talk about the 17th century in France, when you said the century of the Enlightenment means that the decision is enlightened. Enlightened means that the decision is rational, is no longer something inspired by God. Yeah. It's a decision that comes out of a factual analysis of the situation, a factual analysis of your national interest, a factual analysis of the interest of the population. And that should make your decision making then to the benefit of the country, to the benefit of the population, to the benefit of the people who elected you. And that's the reason why intelligence, and I speak especially of strategic intelligence is an important, if not an essential part of this rule of law, where your decision making is based on facts, not on feelings. But why? Because our current leaders are so weak intellectually, they tend to not understand the need of having this intelligence, let's say, assessment. This is probably the only quality, is that they hate Russia. And cannot identify any other quality they may have, if hating Russia might be considered as a quality, by the way, but this is another debate. But they have demonstrated no ability to manage complex situations. And they have not, again, when you are in a position of leader, that applies to a colonel as well as a politician, but very often when it comes to managing conflicts with people or with situation, you have to go beyond your beliefs or your feelings very often. You have to put rationale before your feelings. And that means that regardless of how you feel about this or this guy, you need to apply like rules, regulations, common sense, laws. There are some kind of framework condition that applies well before your feeling. The feeling must be the very last thing that you use in order to manage a situation. And here we have people who seem to be driven by feeling. Decisions seem to be driven by feelings. And you can see that, again, I come from strategic intelligence, where obviously in strategic intelligence, you try to rationalize things, because that's the purpose of strategic intelligence. And remember, we talked about this, about the issue of the Iranian nuclear bomb, alleged nuclear bomb. And although Kaja Kallas represents, as I said, foreign ministry of about 30 countries, and with a lot of problems with relations, economic ties and trade relationship with the rest of the world. No, her focus is Russia, period. Russia. So that's why I'm saying we are in something which is more psychiatric than, we are beyond rationale here. The fact of the matter is that since 2014, and more specifically since 2022, the focus of the European Union has not been to find a solution to the crisis, but to support Ukraine. And it didn't even try to support Ukraine diplomatically, try to find some kind of solution with Russia and all that. No, they provide weapons and they funded the army and whatever, and today the economy to large extent. That means that the European Union, as for the case of Ukraine, but you could say with the case with Palestine, European Union has no strategy for that. They just try to support one actor, as they did for Israel. They support Israel, but there is no attempt to solve the problem. Try to use, when you are not directly involved in a conflict, and in theory, that should be the case, this is obviously a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And regardless of how you feel about Russia or Ukraine, the fact is that being European, you are not directly involved in a conflict. We managed to talk at that time. Today, we cannot. That means that beyond the geopolitical facts and geopolitical relations, there is something more. And this something more is probably in the psychology, the professionalism, the intellectual capabilities also of the leadership that we have, especially in the West. Because here also we see a distinct difference between the leadership we have in countries such as Russia, China, Iran, we can mention, or India, for instance, in Asia at large, where the leadership is obviously much higher standard than in the West, where you have people like Kaya Kallas, these people who don't understand, who are not even able to manage problems in their own country, who are obsessed with Russia, China, whoever. And once you try to argue or try to oppose or let's say challenge the decision or the leadership, then you're automatically qualified as a terrorist. And that happens in France, in UK. When you start demonstrating for Palestine, then you are considered a terrorist. This is something that we never had in Europe before. People demonstrated for the Palestinian, and in particular when the Palestinians were in fact demonstrably terrorists in the 60s or 70s. You had demonstrations in Western Europe for them. Demonstrators were not considered as terrorists. You had the repression and you had all that, as you have today. It didn't change much. And even with Russia, there is no rationale to support a conflict with Russia. You can or cannot like Vladimir Putin. That's up to each. But why do we need to support an armed conflict? This is to the detriment, certainly, of Ukraine. That's no question about that. But it's also to the detriment of Europe. So we are even working against our own interests. So that's why I said we are beyond geopolitics. We are definitely entering the world of psychiatry. And that should be a source of concern, by the way, because we talk about elections coming in France or whoever, but we don't see any leadership that could emerge from the society we know that could change the situation. I feel that those who may become president in France or elsewhere, they're even worse than their predecessors. And if you look at just the example of UK, after Boris Johnson, we were from bad to worse. Yeah. And look at Liz Truss. That goes from bad to worse. And what worries me is that Liz Truss was a poster example of that. But this such an intellectual weakness to lead a country such as UK is is amazing. How come can somebody so stupid even come to the position of being a candidate for the position of prime minister? How come can you have people like Kaya Kallas or even Ursula von der Leyen? Because they have a record of failure. They have records of corruption, of lies. They have the poorest record you can have. We should consider, and I speak from personal knowledge because my part of my family was in the French resistance during World War II. And one of my uncles, who used to be in French resistance in the south of France, was considered as terrorist by the Germans. We are exactly in the same situation. And I would say that probably my uncle was even more ruthless than the Hamas is. I can say that. So this idea of sticking and using the word terrorist as a pretext for not negotiating is, to my mind, first a mistake. And by the way, if we are honest, if we look at what Israel is doing by targeting deliberately civilians, by using inappropriate weapons that are mass destruction weapons, like heavy bombs and things like this, but also targeting individuals as they wait for food, like children, women, and all that. This equals terrorism. This is a clear example. And we don't have any example of similar behavior from the Hamas. If I would compare the use of word terrorism, if we apply it to Hamas or if we apply it to, there is no comparison. Israel is a terrorist state with no discussion. And I think this is something that everybody acknowledges today. While the Hamas, we use the word, but nobody, and I never heard anybody able to provide any example of that. The problem is that we still use the word, as I said, as a pretext for not negotiating, meaning that Russia cannot move or is let's say, cannot move freely in Ukraine. It's a very fuzzy concept that you have. But the bottom line is that we don't know what we want to achieve. As a result, when you don't know what you want to achieve, you cannot have a strategy to address this objective because you don't have an objective. And as a result, you are exactly the situation we are. Just try to maintain the status quo or provide weapons, hoping that this will try to help the Ukrainians. The problem is that, as I have already written in 2022, in my first book, Operation Z, it was clear that the policy or the strategy, or not strategy, but the behavior of the West was in fact just leading Ukraine towards a disaster. And we haven't really changed that. It is still heading towards a disaster. And everybody understands that we are heading towards a disaster, but nobody has any understanding of how to prevent that. And that shows the West has become weak. That's why you had all these sanctions taken all at the same time, brutally by everybody without any concession, all the condemnation from in the UN General Assembly and all that. And the US made every effort to have kind of a unanimity against Russia, because the purpose was to have achieved this kind of collapse within weeks. But it didn't happen. And Switzerland, in my view, didn't understand the opportunity here, because instead of playing the neutrality card, it complied with what the EU and the US were asking for. That means a compliance with the sanctions. And as of today, Switzerland is, depending how you count, but it's the second or the third country that applies the more sanctions on Russia. The first one being the US, and then the second is, depending how you count, either the Switzerland or the United Kingdom. but that depends a little bit how you count. I remember the Washington Post made an article in October last year showing that Switzerland was the second most sanctioning country towards Russia, which is quite odd because Switzerland has no tradition in using sanctions as a way of foreign policy. On the contrary, Switzerland tried always to have kind of a mediatory position and stand in the middle and help to solve issues from both sides. And we had several meetings between Reagan, Gorbachev, Clinton, and so on. So you had all those meetings that happened because Switzerland had this privileged area where both parties could speak freely to each other. And that was, by the way, the case just in 2021 when Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin met in Geneva in June 2021. And that was the last time, because then Switzerland definitely opted for a more Western aligned position. And today, it was a suggestion, by the way, that the Istanbul talks should take place in Geneva. I think that was a proposition from the Americans and so on. And that was refused by the Russians. Russians said, no, Switzerland is no neutral anymore. And therefore, they preferred to have the meeting in Istanbul rather than Geneva. So that explains, that was a missed opportunity for Switzerland. And that was a missed opportunity for the West as well. Because the West not having a strategy, because that's the big problem, that we don't know what the West, the Europeans don't know what they want to achieve in Ukraine. Today, they try to make some kind of damage limitation, but that's all. They haven't defined exactly what they want to achieve in Ukraine. They just provide weapons, period. But they talk about a strategic neutralization of Russia, which means nothing. This is this idea of functional defeat of Russia.